Afternoon. I'm Anthony Painter. I'm Director of Institutional Reform here at the RSA. I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's special lunchtime talk. Just before we begin, can I ask you to make sure your mobile phones are switched to silent? We're reordering your choice architecture already, you see. We're filming today and live streaming over the web, so welcome to all those tuning in online. And a reminder, the hashtag is hashtag RSA Nudge. If you want to get involved in a discussion on Twitter. Housekeeping notices over. It really is my very great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's distinguished guest speaker, Professor Cass Sunstein. Professor Sunstein is an internationally renowned legal scholar and currently the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard. He's founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at the Harvard Law School, and from 2009 to 2012 he was administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. He's the author of many articles and books, including Republic.com, Risk and Reason, and the highly influential Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth and Happiness, which you all will have heard of and no doubt read. However, his very highest accolade comes from the right-wing pundit Glenn Beck, who described him as the most dangerous man in America. He joins us today to share some of his thinking from his latest book, Why Nudge? The Politics of Libertarian Paternalism, in which he builds an ethical as well as a political case for the legitimacy and purpose of governments intervening in the way that we choose. Professor Sunstein will speak for about 25 minutes. I'll have a brief conversation with him. We'll then open it out to you, and we'll aim to wrap it up by 2 o'clock. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Cass Sunstein.
Thank you so much, and thanks for hosting me. It's a real honor. When Glenn Beck called me the most dangerous man in America, I had hoped, that this was a reference to my ability on the squash court. I'm an avid squash player. I did have my professional squash debut within the last week, and it did not go very well. I played a 20-year-old from Pakistan, and I'm not the most dangerous man, at least on the squash court, sorry to say. Okay, so these are going to be remarks at the intersection of the topic of why nudge and the value of choice. So the topic is choice and its place in human life. And there's going to be an ambivalent relationship here between my remarks and the great essay of John Stuart Mill on liberty. So in some ways, Mill is the hero of these remarks, but he's certainly the interlocutor, and there's going to be an ambivalent attitude toward Mill. So the idea of nudging, which as you'll recall is has as its goal preserving freedom of choice while also nudging people in a direction that makes their lives go well. The idea of nudging is designed emphatically to preserve human liberty. But there are a few things that might be said that are skeptical of the project. One is whether nudges are sufficiently respectful of autonomy, or whether there might not be an autonomy infringing dimension to nudges. Another has to do with human dignity, with the sense that there's a risk. Some skeptics fear that people will be treated as children rather than adults. And there's also a question about the value of learning. If people are nudged, it might be wondered, are they able to build up a kind of capital stock in their own minds of capacities, or will they passively go about their lives in a way that's comfortable maybe, but not sufficient for building up knowledge that can enable them to govern themselves? Okay, it is true that nudges are everywhere, whether we like them or not. On cold days, people are more likely to buy products, goods that they will return when it gets warmer. Weather is emphatically a nudge. A website nudges, so does a cafeteria. We know that human beings are not irrational. That would be quite a charge and not a fair one, but they are subject to persistent biases. But even if that's true, the concerns about autonomy and dignity are fair, and they deserve a thorough response. Okay, with respect to the value of choice and its place in human life, we need to anchor in some examples. So organ donation is a famous one, where people might be asked to make an active choice whether they want to be organ donors, or they might be subject to an opt-in or opt-out system. All over the world, nations are interested in providing greener sources of energy. Consumers are a big part of the energy mix. Are you actively choosing what energy provider you have, or do you have one by default? That poses a question about the presence of choice. When you turn on your computer or visit a website, do you make an active choice about privacy, or is it instead presumed one way or the other? With respect to retirement plans and health care plans, there's a pervasive decision whether to have an opt-in approach, or instead something that says, what do you want? Okay, here's a picture of the human condition where there are choices everywhere. I did not draw this picture, but it does capture the thesis of these remarks. These people are facing questions everywhere, and if wherever you look there's a question, then the risk is that your cognitive capacity will be overloaded. And that, I think, is immediately a question for John Stuart Mill, who prizes, rightly, the value of choice. If choices are made everywhere we turn, then we're not going to be turning in many places, because we will be stuck in one or two. Okay, the problem I'm going to highlight is that people often choose not to choose, or would if they were asked, and this can be rational. In fact, it can be more rational sometimes to choose not to choose than to choose in circumstances in which we have limited bandwidth. So if you've ever really appreciated the following blessed suggestion on a website, do not ask me again. If you've ever seen that and smiled and checked, then you will be on to the point. If you've ever had a friend or an organization who asks you repeatedly, what do you want with respect to lunch or vacation or activity, and found that friend or institution a little bit irritating, then the point is, I think, probably transparent. What I'm going to be suggesting is that it's a form of paternalism to override people's choices, including their choices not to choose. And in circumstances in which people have a judgment that they would like not to choose, then we are witnessing paternalism when that choice is itself influenced or overridden. Okay, I'm going to make a set of claims. They're going to be a bit abstract, for which please forgive me. I'll try to specify them with some examples. And the claims are about the following option, either for each of us in our individual lives or for institutions with which we interact. And the options are basically three: whether there's going to be active choosing, where each of us selects, whether there's going to be a default rule of the impersonal variety in the sense that applies to a broad swath of the population, for example, all employees of a large organization or all citizens of a locality. That's an impersonal default rule. Or third, a personalized default rule where an institution, like a friend, decides what is a default rule that suits you in particular. That's a personalized default rule. So in ordinary life, friends and family members, whether the question involves lunch or a conversation topic or a vacation spot or activity over the weekend, chooses often a personalized default, saying this is what we think or I think you will like, subject to override. A personalized default in the institutional setting is a close analog, which is in some sense, I think, alarming, that an institution would know enough about you to choose a personalized default for you, but in some sense it could be a great blessing if there's reason for trust in the institution. Okay, my first claim is that the impersonal default rule, notwithstanding one reading of the liberal tradition, is better than active choosing. So the default rule is better than active choosing. When the context is confusing and unfamiliar, when people would prefer not to choose, when learning doesn't matter much, and when the population isn't heterogeneous along any relevant dimension. So those are the circumstances where an impersonal default rule is really good. so that your employer or your educational institution or your government offers you a default rule and says you can have this. If you don't want it, you can opt out. Freedom is preserved, but this is the status quo unless you make a particular decision. The qualification to this idea is that we need to be able to trust choice architects to produce sensible default rules. If their rules are harmful or dumb, we should insist on active choosing. Okay, second claim. Active choosing is better than an impersonal default rule when choice architects are biased or lack important information. That may be public officials. It may be the University of X. It might be a big company. When the context is familiar, so people don't say, please don't bother me with this, and say instead, I understand it, and it's not a bother. When people would actually prefer to choose, so choice is a benefit rather than a cost, when learning matters, and when there's relevant heterogeneity. I want to underline the point about where learning matters. There are many areas where active choosing is crucial because it helps people develop a kind of understanding and knowledge base that can enable them to embark on enterprises of their own in the future. Now, we don't want to get, I don't think, theological about this point about learning. There are many domains where learning is more important in the abstract than on the ground, so that when writing first developed, some skeptics, prominent skeptics, said this is very bad because people will stop memorizing texts. And that was a fair point. We memorize text less when we have writing, but that's not a convincing, all things considered, objection to writing. It's good that there be writing, even if the ability to memorize is diminished as a result. So we don't want to take the point about learning excessively, but it's nonetheless important in many areas. Okay, the third claim is that personalized default rules, which look a bit science fictional, admittedly, are better than impersonal ones in the face of relevant heterogeneity. So an enduring objection to a default rule, whether we're talking about retirement plans or health care or energy, is that one size doesn't fit all. And if that's the case, then we want personalized default rules that suit you. For retirement plans at, let's say, large employers, a default setting is not a bad idea, but someone who's 25 should have a different default setting from someone who's 65. Someone who's in good health might want a different default plan from someone who's in poor health. And that suggests personalization is a great boon. Okay, the fourth and final claim is that personalized defaults have big advantages over active choosing because they produce benefits in terms of accuracy without requiring people to devote the time and effort to making the choice. So the beauty of the personalized default is that it escapes the crudeness and generality of the impersonal default, which is why personalized defaults are coming. And they also don't require people to devote their limited time and attention to what they might not care about. If choice architects are informed and trustworthy, and if safeguards are in place to protect personal privacy, then there's a strong argument for the personalized default rule. This is meant as a response to the objection from the standpoint of autonomy by saying that autonomous people like this because it fits their circumstances. It allows them to opt out, and it acknowledges that in circumstances in which learning is important, then the case for active choosing ends up being strong enough. Okay, with respect to my claim about the paternalistic character of requiring choosing, what I want to say against those who are concerned about the paternalistic character of default rules as nudges is that to require active choosing in circumstances in which people don't want that is itself a form of paternalism, so that choice requiring paternalism is no oxymoron. If people are busy, confused, unhappy about the idea of taking responsibility in areas where they don't feel themselves competent, not because they're generally incompetent, but because this is not an area that interests or focuses them, then to require them to make an active choice is a form of nannyism. This is in the nature of a tu quoque argument, you too, as against those who prize active choosing. If we take John Stuart Mill's basic arguments against paternalistic intervention, his famous harm principle, the core for Mill is a welfare argument that choosers know a lot better about their individual circumstances than outsiders. That's a forceful point, which is often convincing. It applies also to people who make a choice not to choose or would make exactly that choice if asked. They know best whether this is a circumstance in which their welfare would be promoted by active choosing. And by hypothesis, they've decided not. To concretize, at my own university, when people join, they're defaulted into a retirement plan. I don't have the data, but I'm pretty confident the number of people who make an active choice to override the default retirement plan is really low. And what the university is picking up on is if you ask people who join the university to make a particular choice about their own preferred retirement plan, the welfare of those employees would go down. Say, we want to think about our work, our families, the newspaper, not about the complexities of a retirement plan. Most people. If active choosing were required, it would be a form of paternalism. Many people who believe that Mill is deeply right are not welfarists. Their goal is to preserve individual autonomy, and they think that people have a right to make choices, even if those choices would diminish their welfare, that that's part of what respect for persons entails. If we think that, we ought to be enthusiastic about respect for the choice not to choose as well, oughtn't we? That's an exercise of autonomy. When people choose not to choose on the ground that this is an area that they'd prefer not to become expert in, to override that choice is itself paternalistic. So what I'm insisting here is that active choosing as a requirement is itself an interference with people's welfare and their autonomy. Now, to know whether it is, we need to know whether people choose to choose, but often they don't. Okay, it must be acknowledged that there are some cases in which the argument I've given won't work, and those are cases where the choice not to choose is an alienation of freedom. In the extreme case, people are, voluntarily becoming slaves. In less extreme cases, people are alienating their right to vote. They're choosing not to choose with respect to vote. Or, in a case which at least in many cultures would be deemed similar, they are alienating their decisions about whom they're going to marry. In cases that involve defining choices or intimate choices of this kind, we might think that autonomy or welfare itself contains a barrier against alienation of the right to choose. That's a fair point, but it's only a subset of the cases where people choose not to choose. It's not the category itself, and it should be split off as an important subset. Okay, what can be said for active choosing? Well, Brave New World has a hero named the Savage, kind of ironic, kind of meant, where the Savage says, I don't want comfort, I want God, I want poetry, I want real danger, I want freedom, I want goodness, I want sin. That's a plea for active choosing in circumstances in which it might diminish our well-being in some narrow sense. And in cases in which choice architects aren't good, or in which there's diversity in the population, or in which people's preferences change over time, the Huxley argument for active choosing, which I think is implicit in Brave New World, is very powerful. But let's see what might be said on the other side. There's a passage, an oral passage actually, from MIT economist Esther Duflo, speaking about poverty, and I'm going to try to generalize that argument as a qualification of Huxley's plea for active choosing. What Duflo says orally is we tend to be patronizing about the poor in a very specific sense, which is we tend to think, why don't they take more responsibility for their lives? What we are forgetting is the richer you are, the less responsibility you need to take for your own life because everything is taken care of for you. And the poorer you are, the more you have to be responsible for everything about your life. Stop berating people for not being responsible and start to think of ways instead of providing the poor with the luxury everyone else has. If we do nothing, we are on the right track. For most of the poor,